Introduce our keynote speaker, Michael Stapleton. Michael and I actually go back. He said the other day to me, he goes, we've known each other 40 years. I'm like, no, it's only been 39, please. Can't be that long. But we started back in the 90s together, actually gallivanting along the countryside, visiting clients, and talking to them about how they should use computer-aided drug design to work and figure out what they should be doing in the lab to save time and money. That was back in the 90s, and Mike has gone off to be a thought leader in the life science industry. He's on the board of Scitara and the board of QBD Vision, as well as others. He is definitely somebody that has been in this industry, has seen a lot. He was VP CIO at Merck for a while. That was 2 weeks after he convinced me to go to PerkinElmer, and then 2 weeks later he said, well, I'm off to Merck. So I was like, oh, great, thanks for that. Then went on to Accenture, and so has a ton of experience. And it is with great pleasure for him to be here today, and he'll be talking to us about how digital ecosystems drive value in life sciences. Thank you, Mike.
How you all doing? Everybody good? A little bit of interaction today? That's good. Warm it up a little bit. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Let me start by just thanking Raj and Margaret for the opportunity. I love speaking at events like this, and it's absolutely fabulous to see lots of old friends, old colleagues, and new faces here. So again, I'll be here today and looking forward to conversations around what's important to us in this industry. I got to say to start with, though, this whole sort of thing about the traffic is bullshit, okay? I've already got it wrong, have I? No, okay. I live in Lexington, which is 13 miles away, and it took 50 minutes to get here, and I got here on time. So what's wrong with you lot? What's going on here? We're going to spend the whole day, everybody coming up and congratulating you for being late. It's like Geraldo said, putting Geraldo on the spot. He said, when does a 9 o'clock meeting in the pharmaceutical industry start? About 9:20, 9:25, so we're bang on time. So yeah, I'm going to talk about ecosystems this morning. It's something I've been very passionate about all of my career, from the early, apparently gallivanting days. Wasn't really expecting to be gallivanting today, right through to now, and some new ideas that I want to share this morning with you all. When I talk about ecosystems, I'm talking about the bigger plays in the industry that have been part of many of our lives. So multi-party arrangements, pre-competitive collaborations, consortia, things like that. So where there's a lot of structure, a lot of discipline associated with addressing some of the bigger pre-competitive challenges in the industry. So examples would be Pistoia, examples would be Allotrope, examples would be SiEE, Transcelerate, activities like that. So there are many, many good examples that we can learn from. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about it in two contexts. One context is the word digital and how digital actually facilitates these sorts of activities to drive value in a far more direct and a far more urgent business context. So digital ecosystems, what does that mean? I'm going to bring it to life with a very, very specific point of view around CMC. So a lot of what we've all done in this industry has been probably in drug discovery or clinical. There's this last great bastion of hope, going back to Raj's introduction, of CMC and the opportunities there. So I'm going to use CMC in a very specific proposal to you all about how we could use an ecosystem to really address some of the core challenges in development and manufacturing. So I'm going to bring it to life with one very specific set of ideas. So that's what the next 20 minutes or so are going to be about. Let's start by talking about an example, though, a case study. Let's recognize that there's lots of good work in this industry, and probably the most established and structured consortium in the life sciences space is SiEE. I would say with some confidence, if you're looking at the slides and reading the numbers, that pretty much every single organization in this room, particularly on the pharmaceutical, biotech, healthcare side, is participating in SiEE today. As you can see, there are now over 500 member companies participating in SiDisc. So very much an activity that addresses a critical need in a particular part of R&D, but right across the industry participation. Let's talk about the challenges going back to the start of SiDisc. Many of you might not realize that it actually started back in the 1990s and has been going for a very long time now. And in the early days of the 1990s, I encourage you to go back and read about the sort of history of clinical data management if you're interested in this field. I read this just again yesterday in preparation for today, this great thought leadership article. The 1990s also saw the introduction of the Master Patient Index. That was one of the first attempts at standardization in our industry. How many of you heard of the Master Patient Index? There we go, 1, 2, that's good. What it then goes on to say, and I say this, slightly in humor and slightly to give context to the whole presentation here, a database of patient information used across the healthcare industry. That sounds quite inspiring, doesn't it, so far? However, there were still limitations. This is the 1980s, as computers couldn't communicate with one another. So, that era when SiDisc started was in that world. And the challenges associated with actually getting groups together to discuss, ultimately defining clinical data interchange standards, was fundamental to the scale and growth of that industry. Think about what I just said, though, in the context of where we are today and the introduction by Raj and sort of the sorts of things we know and take for granted today associated with data and the computation to support what we do with data. It's a phenomenal journey. I mean, Margaret said 40 years. It's slightly embarrassing, maybe, possibly, I don't know. But, in that 40-year era, I mean, it has completely transformed from those early days of SiDisc to now. So what are the challenges? If we are interested in starting something like SiDisc in a new area today, for example, CMC, what would be the challenges that we can learn from? Well, the first thing is all around just getting adoption. There's a certain barrier in this industry to getting people together in a room like this to have a common conversation around a set of challenges that are fundamentally pre-competitive. So that's the first thing we try to do. And then you try to define standards. The issue for us with standards and the word standards in this part of the industry, clinical, and as I'll come to CMC, is the regulatory authorities. It's the engagement with the regulatory authorities and the adoption of those standards, the publishing of those standards, and encouraging everybody to actually do that on an ongoing basis. And then there's resources, and resources are critical here. Resources to contribute to this work, but also resources to do something with the work, which fundamentally requires change in all of our work in the pharmaceutical biotech vendor partner ecosystem. So the resource constraints are huge in this industry. We'll come to that in the CMC space because that's really not been thought about in general. But then you see how you do it. There are key figures that launch these activities. The organization's typically set up with a small group of pioneering companies participating. It has some sort of budget constraints and budget input. There's often grants involved in getting these things off the ground and so on. And then it scales. And as I said, it's scaled now to over 500 members, where it actually is well-funded, well-structured, and there's a whole army of thousands of volunteers across the industry who contribute to the ongoing maintenance of these standards. So that's the sort of aspiration here. That's probably the greatest example we have in the industry of this sort of activity. So my aspiration as a leader in this industry is to bring that to life in CMC. There's been a lot of work put into this. I've been very happy to be part of this the last 6 months across the industry to try and articulate how would we get a SiDisc activity going? What would that mean? What would be the benefit of it? How would we go about it? What would we do? What would be the outputs to actually benefit some of the barriers in CMC? And aspirationally, we've called this initiative Project Artemis. We've leaned heavily into NASA's Project Artemis, which aspires in two regards that we want to build off. One is actually getting to the moon using available ecosystem-based capabilities. So not necessarily the invention side, there always is invention, but there's tons of capability out there in private and public companies now that NASA has to try and coordinate and optimize the use of and how it works together. We believe that is very relevant to CMC. CMC isn't about inventing bright new buzzy things, it's actually about coordination of really existing expertise and technology in a smarter, newer way. And the second is to do it with a view of how do you sustain what you do. And this is probably more relevant to development and manufacturing than it is to any other part of the pharmaceutical industry right now, that rather than building one-offs that we can't afford to maintain, or we can't afford to actually scale, we don't know how to scale, we actually have to do things smarter together so that things actually have the chance of being around in 5 years, 10 years with a well thought out plan. So we want to lean on those two aspirations. The ecosystem is critical, we believe, and the ecosystem involves all of you. And the second is do things intentionally that can scale. That could be through design, skill sets, engineering relationships, and so on. And so we've leaned into that, and we've called this project Project Artemis. And that's what I'm going to use as an example here to bring this ecosystem narrative to life for you for CMC. I'm going to emphasize that this isn't me presenting all of this today. This has been about 6 months' work so far with a bunch of input from some key leaders across this industry. We've tried to be quite thoughtful in getting this together so that it has some diversity of opinion and expertise and need going into this initial set of thoughts. So what I'm very excited to do today is to share something with you which is very much an initial set of thoughts, so that you can actually interrogate it, challenge it, give feedback to it. It's an invitation to all of you, your organizations, your companies, to actually participate in this discussion if the CMC area is important to you. So critically in the pharmaceutical space, Ravi and his team at Eli Lilly have been strong leaders in this area from the manufacturing perspective. On the other side of the fence, Ganga and his team, a whole bunch of individuals from Novartis have been important from the pharmaceutical development space. So we've had both manufacturing and pharmaceutical development input into the initial design of these thoughts. From an aspiring biotech to scale-up company, Flagship is probably the best well-known to all of us here locally, but also on the planet probably. Vijay is a tremendous thought leader in the CMC space. He actually comes from Novartis to Flagship. Matt is a digital visionary. We've had a lot of input from Flagship, especially around their portfolio of companies and representing the biotech point of view and their requirements of CMC. And then, particularly on the technology side, a lot of input from Rockwell. Chris and Matt have been tremendous. This is not in any way exclusive. It was to create the initial point of view, which I'm sharing with you all today. It's only been available for about a month now. I presented it in Basel about a month ago. Great feedback, great interaction. Not setting any expectations with you lot. You can all just sit there and nod and smile if you want, or you can ask questions. But you know, it's been very positively received. Since then, I've probably presented it to 20 pharmaceutical companies. Lots of tremendous resonance and feedback. People are getting it, people are resonating around it, and so on. So that's what I encourage you today to do today. These slides are really an abbreviated form of an executive summary. I'll come to this at the end. There is a proposal. It's a meaty proposal, well thought out document. It's available to any and all of you if you want to follow up with me afterwards. So this is really just a snapshot of what we try to pull together. So this is what I'll try and rattle through in the available 20 minutes or so. I'll pose the problem from an industry point of view, first of all. What is going on in our industry that would motivate me standing up here to have a discussion like this with you all? So what are the challenges fundamental to the pharmaceutical, biotech, and contract manufacturers that would actually mean it's worth thinking about doing something like this? Talk a little bit about the opportunity, and then why a pre-competitive collaboration? Why is that a possible solution to some of these problems? And then how we propose getting it off the ground. Because you really need to be quite thoughtful, learn from the CDICs and the Pistoias and bioforums and so on, and really be quite thoughtful about what can we achieve in a year, how does it scale, and so on. So that's the agenda for the next 15, 20 minutes. At the highest level, there's probably two singular motivations here that would explain why this is an important thing to try and address and why now. The first comes from the science side. The science side tells us that the growth of absolutely amazing breakthrough science, particularly in new modalities, is being hampered in some significant way by lack of success in the commercial field. Now, you could put that down to two things. Most people, most things you'll read in this industry will put it down to pricing. And part of that is true. Very niche target markets and very, very complex, expensive solutions that probably manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and healthcare systems haven't quite worked out who owns what and how you achieve what so that a patient can actually get these new therapies. That's true. But these are extremely complex new modalities to actually develop, test, and manufacture. And most of the principles used to go through that process with the regulatory authorities today are still the same approaches that we've used for small molecules through to biologics. So there's wonderful publications out there right now explaining that there's probably an equal opportunity in these new modalities to rethink how you do development and manufacturing completely. And that would increase the certainty of actually getting the right product to the right patient, but also would lower the cost significantly. And so maybe the cost that we're negotiating out there in an inefficient way today is actually the wrong cost, because we could do this far more efficiently. So there's a very clear objective right now in this industry to rethink development and manufacturing around new modalities. This is going to grow. It's not going to go away. You can read the numbers on the slide. There's twice that number in clinical trials right now. So if you carry on at the same lack of success or not addressing this commercial challenge, we are all failing at getting new science and new medicine to patients, which, as Margaret said, is the reason we do what we do. So this is clear. It's right there in front of you. You've got to change something in development and manufacturing to address this problem. You haven't got a choice. It's whether you've got the scale, the tools, the capabilities individually, or, where I'm obviously going to lead, we do something as an industry, or a bit of both. So the first argument is science. The second argument, going back to Raj's introduction, is actually the P&L. It's the cost of doing stuff in the pharmaceutical industry. It's actually probably a lot worse than Raj politely described. And I can get away with it because I'm the keynote. But it's an atrocious industry from the point of view of return on invested capital. By any benchmark, I mean, these are public figures. You can all get the documents or I can send them to you. But what would be a good comparison, do you think, between the pharmaceutical industry and another industry? Any ideas? Maybe the semiconductor industry, possibly?
I'd say the government source.
Government, come back to that in a moment, you're right. McKinsey study, 9 industries. Where was the pharmaceutical industry in its understanding of digital? 8th. Who was worse? Public. There you go, well done, you're better than the public systems. Come back to that in a moment, though. You're ahead of it. You've probably been reading the slides. This is all about the actual cost of doing development and manufacturing, guys. And it's prohibitively expensive, which means 2 things. One is it's expensive. The second is you probably haven't got the bandwidth, budget, skill set, time, whatever, to explore anything else yourself significantly different. And that's a huge challenge in this industry right now. If you wanted to rethink business processes between pharmaceutical companies and contract manufacturers at the strategic level, nobody's got the bandwidth all the time to do that individually because they're all spending time and money doing this. And this is getting worse as well. This isn't getting better, this is getting worse. The more complex, the more expensive, back to my prior slide, means that this actually gets worse. And there's very simple ways of analyzing this, looking at the scientific aspiration, the efficiency, and looking at the output, the effectiveness, are simple measures of R&D productivity. And you can interrogate all of this yourself. There are many, many articles out there. But if you do, you will see that the low-lying fruit, if you like, to actually focus on is development and manufacturing. Drug discovery is doing its thing and will always do its thing. Clinical trials gets 3/4 of the budget and an incredibly intense amount of focus of resource and innovation associated with that resource. The rest of development and manufacturing get peanuts. That's the truth. So something's got to change here, because if you want to get existing products out to market-specific opportunities, patients, cost basis, reimbursement, whatever, you're going to have to change something. Overwhelmingly, everybody agree? Overwhelming, any dispute? I'd love it if somebody tried. Okay. So that's the idea, okay? There's 2 real principles here that drive us to want to do something that is quite accurately called a bottleneck in this industry. It is the CMC bottleneck. it's quite interesting that, if you're a shareholder or investor in a pharmaceutical company, you're putting a lot of pressure on this, ecosystem of activities I just described. Almost all of your focus is to get something into clinical trials as soon as possible, because that fundamentally derives your first point of value in the market and the future value of what you're doing to the company and the industry. So there's a huge, intense focus on getting to clinical trials. And then the panic starts because you haven't actually done all the pre-work for CMC. Any smart person will stand up here and tell you that has to start earlier in the process. It has to start in a very structured, disciplined way in late research, early development, prior to clinical trials. But it hardly ever does. So there's a pressure point here from the pharmaceutical industry and its aspirations financially associated with a very costly process to get a new drug to clinical trials and then run successful clinical trials. At the same time, there's a scramble of activity which is inefficient and not well supported by technology or skill sets or partners that then kicks off around technology transfer and regulatory filings that then proceeds for years through development and manufacturing. So that's what this is all about. It's recognizing that and bringing it up the agenda, bringing it forward, establishing it in that way. I would say, and I'll come back to this, there is a lot of work around standardization of data, taxonomies, ontologies, standards in the industry, and I'll refer to that again later on. There's tons of that. There is virtually no standardization around business processes. So that's what this is about. If we actually had that data layer that many of my colleagues are going to talk about today through the agenda, how do I actually establish standards around business processes? Yes?
Especially with such disparate business processes. Mm-hmm. 20 years ago, it was all about small molecules, mm-hmm. right? Now it's, mRNA, it's CRISPR, it's other types of therapies that are burgeoning.
Yes, spot on. I mean, if you just take something as simple as a QTPP, quality target product profile, something as simple as that. In most pharmaceutical industries, your point are well made because that will vary by therapeutic area and part of the pharmaceutical company and its relationships with external contract manufacturers who will have a very, very different paper or paper on glass versions of those processes as well. Zero efficiency associated with that, zero standardization. No reason why, other than it hasn't been attempted. So this, yes?
I have some thoughts. I mean, it's great problems, but I think even when we have some standards, I remember when the IDMP first came up with a suite of the ISO standards, right, for a lot of the identification lists of drug products. The adoption of the pharma business has been very, very challenging. In fact, if it goes back to the front end of research, these thought processes have been embedded all along.
Yeah.
It's too difficult, I think, at the end
Yeah.
to do processes.
Yeah. Yep. Again, these are wonderful points because we'll get to them as we go through, but just to take the time to respond, there's probably a growing expertise and fluency around the data side of this now, thanks to all of the work that Pistoias and others have done to actually socialize and educate around fair data, and we've got talks today and so on. So that's growing. It's also probably growing because fearless leaders up there with VP job titles and CIO job titles got very excited by something called AI in the last few years and basically told teams of people to do something without actually thinking through what it meant, mainly through peer pressure or, scared of not being left behind. So there's something going on in the data world. It's really around the business process. It's connecting that data world to the business processes and actually understanding that, if between pharmaceutical company and external contract manufacturer where you might do 4 or 5 technology transfers associated with just one product, if you had efficiencies that were enabled digitally between those two partners, you might take, this was Lilly's aspiration coming to this conversation. I mean, it's quite, just to show you the potential here. The way they framed it themselves, a tech transfer for Lilly takes somewhere between 6 and 18 months right now. That's pretty normal across the industry. They aspire out of this to get it down to a week or a day. That is their vision. Now imagine what that would do to Raj's comments at the start, the economics of this industry. If tech transfers were purely digital, you took the human overhead out completely, and you got it down to a week or a day per tech transfer. That's the aspiration and the opportunity, I think, around sort of focusing on business processes. Go on. And
That reminds me of something a former VP at Pfizer once said, Buzz Q, hand-to-man in a day with a gram,
Yep,
right?
yep.
Not sure it's possible, but I mean, it's definitely a vision.
Any other benchmarking of any other industry will tell you that a tech transfer could be purely digital. Any other analysis of this industry would tell you that it's all the human intervention associated with non-standard processes that mean it's 6 to 18 months ago. So I'm not talking about brain surgery here. This is pretty straightforward if we could afford to do it and coordinate ourselves to do it. So there's 4 areas we want to focus on. Probably, and this varies by company that I talk to, 70, 80% of the work in this space is manual and empirical. That's PowerPoints, it's PDFs, it's Excel spreadsheets, it's I don't know, it's somewhere, it's SharePoint hell. That describes most of these activities today, at best. The high cost limits doing anything else, basically, because it is a panic mode, and it is a system and a process that we've been doing for years, so therefore I go to it every time. I haven't got time to think about doing anything differently or, whatever. The standardization has to be taken up a level, and then we're going to talk about this. It's really important to get out of just the data layer and get into the knowledge layer. Because if all I do is talk about the data, I'm not really solving the big problem here. So knowledge frameworks are probably more important in our lingo coming out of this talk than data frameworks. We need to mature around our understanding of institutional knowledge. Those are the 4 takeaways. So to your point about McKinsey, McKinsey did that benchmark, and they redid it again 2 years ago and published a different point of view around it last year. And these were the 5 areas that McKinsey said Biopharma has to focus on relevant to CMC to increase their digital mindset. I'd say that the ones on the left and the right are pretty obvious to anybody in this room, because it's really articulating that effort in development and manufacturing was almost isolated, or is isolated still today, from drug discovery and early development and science, rich science, and is isolated from the market, from the patient. And that itself has to change. That wealth of information from drug discovery and from the market, from the patient, has to be brought into and integrated within the CMC world. So that's the left side and the right side here. There's a data-driven approach that is at the core of this, and I will come back to this again and again and again. How do you build this muscle? Well, it's got to be a data-driven approach, and it's got to be a structured data-driven approach. We have to be able to do what we've just talked about, which is enable far more seamless transfer of knowledge and expertise and decision-making at points in the value chain, internally and externally. And fundamentally, back to the whole premise here of Project Artemis, we have to take on board sustainability, because this industry doesn't have the ability or the investment profile to do all of this as a bunch of one-offs that are going to get thrown away. It has to do it at some level of scale, like CDISC. So those were the 5 sort of connections to McKinsey's assessment of the industry. As I said, the whole approach has to start with a maturity around structured data. I hope this is something that resonates with an audience like this, given the profile of Margaret and Raj's intro and where people are focused and their motivations and a lot of the talks today. But getting to the point where you take that document-centric point of view, whether it is hard copy in most cases or paper on glass in other cases, and actually start to interrogate the content and atomize the content and look for relationships between the content so that you have a far more rich point of view around a structured data set is the foundation here. And wherever you start that work is really up to you. Could be a new drug program, could be an existing program being repurposed for a new market, could be a heavy lift of a portfolio of prior drug programs that you want to just bring in to increase the knowledge assets within a company. There's tons of ways of starting this, but you have to have a very, very deliberate focus to get from that document-centric point of view, which is probably 80–90% of the world today, to this more atomized view of connected, structured data. And if everybody accepts that as a premise, we're good, we're moving on. If you don't, we could have a good, healthy argument about that. But this has to be something that you feel comfortable with wherever you are in the journey and whoever you work with. Yes?
Can you add in your own words your definition of what digital is in that, I think you are making this point that digital is not just a PDF file.
Yeah.
It's the next step. How would you put it in terms of what qualifies as digital?
Yeah, so digital to me in the context of the slide we're looking at means a very, very rich set of connected data that has expertise, decision points, times, risk assessments, quality assessments associated with every single attribute within that sphere of a product profile or a manufacturing process or whatever. It is then interrogatable, it is predictable, it is usable in any context by any tool or any person within or outside an organization. It's easy to maintain, it's easy to add to, it can grow, it has some significant future relevance as opposed to a static point of view, and it has a low cost of maintenance. I riffed that wasn't bad, was it? I think, it's a key conversation, though, because, if you're not comfortable with really where you are in this journey, whoever you are, pharmaceutical company, biotech, CDMO, software partner, IT partner, services, this has to be the future. And I would say, for those of you in the audience here who are deep in this space, this is a requirement in the future from the regulatory agencies. So you haven't got a choice. You could sort of do the whole millennium thing again, wait, pretend it's not happening, then pay Accenture shitloads of money, and they do it in half an hour, and then you find out you didn't actually need to do it. In this case, you're going to have to do it. You're going to have structured data submissions. It could be 3 years, could be 5 years. The regulatory authorities vary in that, and it varies by therapeutic area, their guidance and so on. You're going to have to do it, though. So it's when you build the muscle. How do you get the capabilities going, and how do you start to scale them? Once we have the structured data, we then need to convert to knowledge. And there's a stack here, and it's a very important stack. It's a vertical stack that represents the layers that we have to take on board in thinking of how to bring the value of this structured data, whatever technology we use from whatever vendor, whether we're homegrown, whether we license something or whatever, we have to go through these steps. They're very important steps that start with an understanding of that structured data, using typically the FAIR data principles. We hear a lot about that today. Then sorry.
Doesn't that approach, look, I've been in big pharma. Mm-hmm. That approach works well for big pharma because their data is already structured, right? At least a good amount of it.
No.
The smaller biotech companies, not as much.
I think, again, push back slightly. And 80% of the sources of this today in development and manufacturing are not structured. They are PDFs, they are Excel files, they are documents stored in some SharePoint monster. So you might be true in drug discovery, where there's a lot of progress. You might be true in clinical, where there's a lot of progress, but in development and manufacturing, gentle pushback, you're wrong. Yeah. And that's the opportunity, and that's the need, to be honest. That's why it's so important to have this conversation about development and manufacturing systems and documents and decision-making and business processes, because it is all steeped in that old paper or paper-on-glass world. So imagine I have that structured data. I actually have a relevance for that structured data in the world that I work in here, CMC, because I have particular data types that I want to play with, and they're listed there. They're common data types that I can actually start to give some meaning to that structured data. I then build capability, functionality. I can do that myself as a pharmaceutical company. I can build my own use cases, whatever. I can work with a software company, license their products, whatever. But I build functionality. And there's functionality that has very rich impact. I connect that functionality to workflows that actually solve problems. Tech transfer would be an example of that. So I bring together the right functionality based on that structured data to actually solve problems. If I do that correctly, I can directly connect to solving business problems. And this is critical in development manufacturing for all the reasons that I've said. There's a whole set of realized value here, which is articulated at the top level, which I then start to appreciate because I have those capabilities to deploy. That's the thought process. You have to start with the bottom layer and build up with a relevance and a capability directly solving business problems. Nearly another question there. Oh, good. I'm going to get shouted at by Mark.
Just a discerning eye.
A discerning eye. That was it's almost British in its. I'm going to get shouted at by Margaret because I've taken way too much time probably. So I'm going to try and speed up here. I could do all this and justify all this for all the reasons I've said. It's not brain surgery, all right? So the industry needs to do this. It needs to build these sort of capabilities. Whatever tech stack you use, whatever partners you work with, you need to build this capability. There is a real urgent need as well to do this for a more modern reason, and that is around exploitation of artificial intelligence. You're not going, again, I love being provocative in meetings like this, you're not going to be successful exploiting AI to design, optimize, improve business processes in the way that I'm describing if you train AI on the raw data. AI has to be trained on those knowledge assets that you build through a stack like that. And that is proven, whether you accept it or not. So you've got to do the hard work. And I think people are starting to realize this, and it's coming up more and more in conferences and proceedings now. But you have to do the hard work building that structured data and understanding all of the relevance, the context, the importance, the human side of all that data is caught as well, so that you can actually train models that can actually do very powerful things. That will be more true here in this space, probably than in any other exploratory investigation in drug discovery, for example. So it's really quite urgent to do this if you believe that the exploitation of AI could help you design processes in a manufacturing plant, optimize their use of resources, and so on and so forth, which is an example that most people are benchmarking right now. So then, the pivot here. Why, if I'm going to do all of that, can't I just get on and do it? Well, one of the reasons is time and money. The second is really a lot of what I've just said, the industry has to do at some point in a way that it acknowledges with the regulatory authorities that it's done it in a consistent way so that all partners are doing something in a very similar, reproducible, scalable way, just like CDISC. So one argument would be I don't have the time and money as an individual company to do everything you just talked about. That's always true. It's especially true in this space. The second argument could be if you actually want to standardize business processes between development, manufacturing, and company, and so on and so forth, and the regulatory authorities are involved in the heart of all of that, then the industry is going to have to come together to actually have that discussion at some point and actually agree. So these are the reasons why we believe, it is the time to build an ecosystem around this opportunity. There's an approach to doing this. I'm going to take less time on these slides now, just sensitive to the overall agenda and the day. But there's an approach to doing this, which I've sort of suggested already, which starts with that getting that data into knowledge models. That is foundational, we believe, as an industry, not just as individual constituents within the industry. And then standardizing those business processes, automating them, how we collaborate between company and company, how we connect that to other predictive capabilities like digital twins and so on and so forth, and then how we back integrate into drug discovery and forward integrate into healthcare. That is a route that makes sense, it's logical, but you've got to start with that first piece. Again, this is just trying to be realistic. How do you approach this? What do you take on first of all? What's meaningful and so on? Who do you want to come together to do this? Well, I would say quite openly, and this is in the proposal document for those of you that are interested, that it's an open discussion right now. Anybody and everybody who's got an opinion, contributes, works in CMC, related to CMC, in any one of these types of companies, should be interested in this discussion. So if there's time, bandwidth, interest, motivation, we encourage anybody and everybody to participate. Because really, the quicker we get critical mass and get it off the ground, the more we can do, the more we can educate, so on and so forth. But just to go through them, the consulting companies, the McKinseys, and others have tremendous expertise around benchmarking and bringing together thought leaders in the business in this industry. Pharmaceutical biotech CDMO well represented. Particularly, I would say the focus should be on the CDMOs because there's huge opportunity to upskill capability technology in that world and its relationship digitally to the pharmaceutical industry. Whole bunch of capabilities out there in the software automation world. Thought leaders in academic and industry groups, so the Bestoyers, the Allotropes, Bioforums, all of these have got something to contribute here. It's not to recreate and do what others are already doing. It's actually to bring them into the fold and actually focus on the business processes, so on and so forth. So this is the idea. Get critical mass, get it off the ground, get the discussion going. To be realistic, we've sort of laid out a plan. Again, for those of you who want the proposal, you'll see this in detail. We've laid out a plan that is, let's focus on a 12-month period, the next calendar year, get it off the ground. It's an open membership drive to get people to have this discussion, give feedback, so on and so forth. But more importantly, is to actually do something. So that it's not just a talking shop, it's not just a whole bunch of industry reports and so on. We have 2 work streams proposed, I'll show you them on the next slide, where we actually do some work and actually prove how we might go about this and actually give participants tangible assets back at the end of 12 months. That's the digital ecosystem, which is probably very different to C-Disk back in the 1990s. And then there's a whole bunch of just cadence around socializing and so on. Then we move into a scale phase. If we're successful getting this off the ground and we actually do something useful, the proposal will then be to actually scale it as a not-for-profit organization. It stands on its own and it grows as an industry practice. Thank you, Margaret. These are the 2 work streams. The 2 work streams are very much focused on business processes, identifying some business processes, actually standardizing them, with the participation of all the members, delivering those to the members at the end. So there's an agreement and a dialogue and a conversation that starts about how do we do this. The second is the legacy world of, back to your point about the unstructured data and development manufacturing, how do we get it into a knowledge base like this? Huge amount of pilots going on right now, tons of technology from Amazon, Google, Microsoft, everybody else. How do we learn from all that and do it at scale? Not just to get the data ingested, but actually to build rich knowledge bases and then test those rich knowledge bases out with the top work streams. So 2 well thought out work streams, then we scale up. If we do it well, there's tons of areas we can focus on. This is for discussion. Everybody can give feedback on this. This agenda for year 2 and year 3 and beyond is really just a bunch of thought leadership right now. The ultimate outcome is to have impact on the business. And back to my early 2 slides, there's 2 clear ways we can measure that. Probably productivity is the low-hanging fruit. Just simple measures around productivity. All the things that I've talked about. So that, Margaret, is it. See, I was playing with you there. I knew I was going to go to speed up. As I've mentioned a few times, this is just get this off the ground. It's a wonderful opportunity to tell you what I think is possible with the ecosystem world, especially the digital ecosystem world, a world that is digital native in its approach to solving business problems. It's a new world for CMC. And a new opportunity, even if you're tangential to CMC in this room today from drug discovery or clinical or other parts of the ecosystem, you will contribute to this conversation whether you realize it or not at some point, because the skill set for new therapeutics are getting them from early stage drug discovery to a patient are very different timelines and dynamics and risk profiles than anything this industry's ever done. So you will be part of it at some point. There is a very, very detailed proposal here. Margaret and team will make these slides available. You have my contact details. If you think you have a colleague who would be interested in just reviewing the document, giving some feedback, please follow up. But it's a very well thought out proposal that is really there for people to challenge and give feedback on. So with that, Margaret, thank you very much. Yeah, if I have time for any questions.
Is there any questions?
You all sold on the idea? Yeah? Just at the idea, concept level?
I might give us one point to share with you. I agree with a lot of things sharing. But this entire pharma business, like think about the COVID days. I work with Regeneron, I can certainly attest to it. The regulatory framework also has to be, in my mind, revised as you look forward. But our industry was successfully able to get the COVID cocktails, whatnot, very rapidly in a very compressed. I think so. While the timeline you showed, I mean, of course, enormous effort was put into it to get to it, but the system was able to move that.
I think you're right. I mean, I don't think anybody in the room would disagree that there's some extremely positive learnings from that COVID experience, both the design part, but also the regulatory approval part. It even shook the world of the shareholder perception of the industry up, because the shareholder perception of the industry was, well, why aren't you doing this routinely?
Exactly,
I would argue back to my slides that there's an engagement with the regulatory authorities at an appropriate time to have that discussion. Because the regulatory authorities are not today doing anything around business process standardization. They are involved in many, many different work streams around the data side of this, and that again should contribute. But there's nothing going on around business process standardization. And that, we believe, as an industry, we should be taking to the FDA and others and saying, you should be thinking about this, you should be participating with us in this. But there's a time to do that when you've actually got a bit of muscle and you're actually making some progress. But there are a lot of learnings from the whole COVID vaccine.
Great, thank you, Mike.
Thank you.